After my mother died, I discovered the HOA had stolen 2,100 acres of our family farmland through fraud while she battled cancer. But they had no idea I controlled the entire region's power grid as Northeast Power Supervisor. What would you do with that kind of leverage against people who stole your dying mother's legacy? I never thought I'd come back to Pine Grove Valley. Not after 15 years away. But there I was, standing on the creaky porch of my childhood home, holding the keys to Mom's farmhouse, and fighting back tears. "This is yours now," said Mr. Jenkins, Mom's old lawyer, handing me a thick folder. "All 2,100 acres of Johnson family farmland, just like your mother wanted. Generations of history. Right here." The wind swept across the cornfields, bending the stalks like they were bowing in respect. Mom had fought so hard to keep this place going while battling cancer. I ran my fingers over the worn wooden railing she painted blue every spring, without fail. My phone buzzed. Work again. As the regional supervisor for Northeast Power Authority, my bosses weren't happy I'd taken emergency family leave. But what choice did I have? Mom was gone, and someone needed to handle her affairs. I had just started unpacking when a sharp knock rattled the screen door. A woman with perfectly styled blonde hair and a smile that didn't reach her eyes stood on the porch. Two men in polo shirts with the Meadowbrook Association logo waited behind her. "You must be Helen Johnson's son," she said, extending a manicured hand. "I'm Karen Thompson, president of the Meadowbrook Homeowners Association. We were so sorry to hear about your mother's passing." I shook her hand, confused. "Thanks, but what brings the HOA out here? Mom's farm isn't part of your development." Karen's smile tightened. "Well, that's actually why we're here. There are some covenant violations we need to discuss." "Covenant violations?" "This farm has been here since 1920. Your neighborhood has only been around for, 10 years? 15, she corrected. "And while that may have been true once, your mother never officially contested our annexation of this property. According to county records filed 5 years ago, this land falls under our jurisdiction now." My stomach dropped. "That's impossible." Karen handed me an official-looking document. "These papers were filed while your mother was still the owner. As you can see, the Meadowbrook Association's boundaries were legally expanded to include this property." I stared at the signature at the bottom. It looked like Mom's, but something seemed off about it. "There must be some mistake," I said. "My mother would never agree to this." "Nevertheless," Karen continued, gesturing toward the barn, "those farm vehicles are in violation of our storage ordinances. And that fence needs to be brought up to code. We'll give you 30 days to address these issues before fines begin." As they walked back to their luxury SUV, I noticed survey stakes with orange ribbons lined up at the edge of our cornfield. They hadn't been there at Mom's funeral 3 days ago. That night, I couldn't sleep. Mom's paperwork was scattered across the kitchen table: tax forms, medical bills, land deeds dating back to my great-grandfather. Something kept nagging at me about Karen's documents. Why would Mom ever sign away control of our land? I pulled out the filing cabinet from Mom's office, the one she kept locked. The key had always hung on a chain around her neck. The one the funeral director had given me with her personal effects. Inside the bottom drawer, hidden beneath old photo albums, I found a leather-bound journal with "Keep Fighting" written on the cover. My hands trembled as I opened it. Inside detailed accounts of her battles with the HOA. Harassment over her tractor being visible from the road. Complaints about the roosters crowing too early. Threats over the height of our corn. But more disturbing were her notes about land surveys mysteriously changing. Property line markers moving overnight. HOA members trespassing to take photos of violations. The final entry was dated 3 months ago, when she was in the hospital for her last round of chemo. "They're taking advantage of my sickness. I don't have the strength to fight them anymore. God forgive me for failing to protect what my father and his father built." I wiped tears from my eyes and kept reading. Mom had collected evidence. Photos of original boundary markers. Copies of the real property lines. Even recordings of conversations with HOA board members. She'd been building a case. On the last page was a sticky note with a phone number and a name. Sarah Winters, attorney. Call when you're ready to fight back. Outside, a car slowly drove past the house, headlights off. I peeked through the curtains and saw Karen Thompson taking pictures of our property from her Mercedes. Sleep didn't come that night. Instead, I pored over Mom's documents, comparing her real signature on bank statements to the one on Karen's annexation papers. They weren't the same. Not even close. By dawn, I knew 3 things for certain. The HOA had falsified documents. They'd taken advantage of my mother's illness. They had no idea who they were messing with. This is criminal, Sarah Winters said, adjusting her glasses as she examined Mom's journal and the HOA documents side by side. Her office walls were lined with law books and framed newspaper clippings about cases she'd won against corporate developers. Those signatures don't match at all, I said, pointing to the differences. And look at the dates, this one is from when Mom was in the hospital. She couldn't even hold a pen that day. Sarah nodded grimly. The HOA has been systematically pushing boundaries, literally, for years. They've been planning a luxury development called Harvest Estates on your eastern fields. Your mother fought them at every turn. So what do? File criminal charges for fraud and get a court order to stop any development, she said. But I warn you, the Meadowbrook Association has deep pockets and connections at City Hall. Karen's husband, Jack, sits on the county zoning commission. This won't be easy. My phone buzzed with a work emergency power outage in Sector 7. As Northeast Power Supervisor, I couldn't ignore it. I need to handle this, I told Sarah, but I want to move forward with everything you suggested. I'll prepare the paperwork, she promised. Meanwhile, document everything. And I mean everything. Driving home to change into my work clothes, I spotted Doug Wilson, the HOA treasurer, hammering no trespassing signs along what used to be our property line. Only now, the signs were 50 feet into our cornfield. I pulled over. What do you think you're doing? Doug barely looked up. Marking HOA property boundaries. There's a board meeting tonight about developing this section. This is Johnson land. It's been in my family for generations. He smirked. Not according to county records. You might want to check the updated plat maps. My blood boiled, but I kept my voice steady. Those documents are fraudulent, and you know it. Prove it, he challenged. Meanwhile, we break ground next week. After handling the power outage, I went straight to the county records office. The clerk, Mrs. Patel, had been friends with Mom. I was wondering when you'd come by, she said, her eyes sad. Strange things happened with your mother's property records last year. She pulled up the digital files on her computer. See these lot boundaries? They changed 3 times in 6 months. Each time, more of your land became part of Meadowbrook. I tried calling your mother, but she was so sick by then. Who submitted these changes? I asked. Mrs. Patel checked the logs. All filed by Jack Thompson on behalf of the Zoning Commission. Karen's husband. Of course. Can I get copies of everything? The original boundaries and all these changes? Already made them for you, she said, handing me a USB drive. Your mother helped my son get a scholarship to engineering school. I haven't forgotten that. That evening, I received an email from Karen with an attached PDF. Official Notice of Community Development Plan. The document outlined Phase 1 of Harvest Estates' 60 luxury homes to be built on what they were now calling Meadowbrook East Expansion. My family's eastern cornfield. Construction would begin in just 5 days. I was about to call Sarah when my work laptop pinged with an alert. As part of my job at Northeast Power, I supervised the emergency protocols for the entire county grid. A system check was flagging potential issues with power capacity for new development in Sector 12. Exactly where our farm was located. Opening the utility maps, I realized something that made my heart race. Any major development in this area would require my department's approval for power infrastructure. The existing grid couldn't handle 60 new homes without significant upgrades. And who had to sign off on those upgrades? Me. My phone rang, displaying Karen's number. "We need to discuss fence height regulations," she started, without greeting. "And those unsightly farm vehicles visible from Meadowbrook Drive." "Actually," I cut in, "we need to discuss fraudulent land claims and forged signatures." She paused. "I don't know what you're talking about." "I think you do. I've seen the real property records, Karen. And Mom's journal, documenting every HOA harassment while she was fighting cancer." Her tone changed instantly. "You know nothing about real estate law or development rights. That land is ours now. In fact, we're beginning construction next week. If you try to interfere, you'll be hearing from our attorneys." "Funny thing about new developments," I said calmly. "They need power infrastructure approval from Northeast Power Authority." "Which is just a formality," she snapped. "Usually, yes. But not when the regional grid supervisor has concerns about capacity issues, or when they discover evidence of fraud." Silence filled the line. "Who exactly do you work for?" Karen finally asked, her voice tight. "Northeast Power. I oversee the entire county grid, including Meadowbrook." "You're bluffing," she said, "but I heard the uncertainty." "The HOA meeting is tomorrow night, right?" "I'll see you there. Bring your husband. We have a lot to discuss about property lines, forged signatures, and power requirements." I hung up before she could respond. Within minutes, my phone exploded with texts from unknown numbers. Other HOA board members, I assumed. I ignored them all. Instead, I walked the boundaries of our farm as the sun set, touching the soil my ancestors had worked for generations. In the golden light, I could almost see Mom walking beside me, pointing out where she'd planted her first crop, where Dad had built the irrigation system before he died, where my great-grandfather had first staked his claim to this land. "I won't let them take this from us," I whispered to the wind. "I promise." Back at the house, I spread the property maps across the kitchen table and began marking the true boundaries with a red pen. Next to them, I placed the grid infrastructure plans showing every power line, transformer, and substation in the county. The HOA had no idea what they were up against. They thought they were dealing with a city boy who'd abandoned his roots. They were wrong. They were dealing with Helen Johnson's son. And tomorrow, they'd learn exactly what that meant. The noise woke me before my alarm. Loud engines roaring. Trees cracking. I jumped out of bed and ran to the window. Yellow bulldozers were knocking down the old maple trees at the edge of my cornfield. 5 workers in bright vests moved around while Karen Thompson pointed and gave orders. I grabbed my phone and called Sheriff Miller. "They're destroying my property," I yelled, pulling on my boots. "I'll be there in 10 minutes, he promised. I ran outside in my pajamas and work boots, waving my arms. "Stop. You can't do this, this is my land." My heart pounded as I watched another 100-year-old maple crash to the ground. Karen spotted me and smiled. Like she'd just won a prize. She wore a fancy pink suit with shiny gold buttons, looking completely out of place next to the muddy equipment. "Good morning, neighbor," she said sweetly. "Beautiful day to begin our new development, isn't it?" "This is my land," I said, trying to stay calm while feeling like I might explode. "You have no right to be here." "Actually," she said, tapping her clipboard, "the Meadowbrook Association owns this parcel now." Sheriff Miller's car pulled up, lights flashing. He stepped out, looking serious, his gray mustache twitching like it always did when he was upset. "What's going on here?" he asked, adjusting his hat. Karen handed him a thick folder. "We're beginning phase 1 of Harvest Estates. All permits and paperwork are in order." Sheriff Miller flipped through the pages, squinting at the fine print. I could barely breathe, waiting for him to speak. "Ma'am, these permits are for Lot 156, he finally said. "According to county records, this is Lot 27. still registered to Johnson Family Farms. Karen's smile dropped. For a second. Then it returned even bigger. There's been a mix-up in the paperwork, she said smoothly. That's not a mix-up, I said, stepping closer. That's fraud. Karen let out a forced laugh. Mistakes happen. But our development plans were approved months ago. Not for this exact spot, I countered. This land has been in my family for generations. Well, Karen said, crossing her arms, your mother signed it over to us. Perhaps you weren't aware. My work phone rang suddenly, the special ringtone for emergencies. I glanced at the screen. A power substation was down, affecting thousands of people. I have to take this, I told Sheriff Miller. Please don't let them destroy anything else. He nodded. I'll make sure they stop until we sort this out. As I walked away to handle the power emergency, I heard Karen's voice rise behind me. This is outrageous. We have deadlines to meet. For 3 hours, I worked to fix the substation problem. Being the regional grid supervisor meant I couldn't ignore emergencies even with my own crisis happening. By the time I returned home, the workers and equipment were gone. But they'd left behind a mess of fallen trees and torn up earth. Sheriff Miller had made them stop, but not before they'd cleared nearly an acre. My stomach hurt looking at the destruction. These were trees my great-grandfather had planted. I walked to the mailbox, hoping for good news from my attorney. Instead, I found papers taped all over my barn and fence posts. Big red letters spelled, "Cease and desist." The paper claimed I was blocking necessary community improvements and demanded I stop interfering with HOA business. They warned of huge fines and legal action if I didn't cooperate. My hands shook as I called Sarah Winters, my attorney. They're trying to scare you, she said after I explained everything. Don't remove those notices yet. We need to document everything. That night, I couldn't sleep. I spread out all my mother's papers on the kitchen table, her old journals, farm records, and land maps. In one journal from last year, she'd written, Karen stopped by again about selling the East Field. Told her no. Later found survey stakes at the property line. Something feels wrong. I opened my work laptop and pulled up the power grid maps for our county. Every home, business, and streetlight connected like a giant spiderweb on the screen. The Meadowbrook Association neighborhoods all fed from Substation 12, the one I personally redesigned last year. My phone buzzed with a text from my old friend Emma, who worked at the county clerk's office. Found something weird in the land records. Can we meet tomorrow? I stared at the message. Then back at the power grid map. An idea started forming in my mind. If the HOA wanted to play dirty, maybe it was time they learned who they were really dealing with. Outside, thunder rumbled across the valley. Rain began tapping on the roof as I studied the emergency protocols for Substation 12. As the storm grew louder, I made a list of everyone who might help me fight back. This wasn't just about land anymore. It was about justice. For my mother. HOA meeting night. Everyone, please take your seats, the secretary's voice echoed through the packed community center. I stood in the back, watching Karen Thompson arrange her papers at the front table. She hadn't noticed me yet. My hands felt sweaty as I clutched my folder of evidence. Attorney Sarah Winters stood beside me, along with Mr. Jenkins, Mrs. Olson, and Mr. Diaz, 3 neighbors who had lived in Pine Grove Valley for over 60 years. First item on tonight's agenda, the secretary announced. Updates on the Harvest Estates development. Karen stood up, wearing a smug smile and a bright red blazer. Thank you all for coming, she began. I'm happy to report that, despite some minor setbacks, our luxury home project is moving forward. The Johnson property has been secured, and construction will resume next week. My blood boiled hearing her lie so easily. Several board members nodded approvingly while homeowners whispered excitedly about property values going up. Karen continued. We need to discuss enforcement actions against certain individuals interfering with community improvements. I took a deep breath and called out. Excuse me. I'd like to address the board. Karen's smile froze. This is a closed meeting for members only. Sarah stepped forward. As legal counsel for the Johnson family, my client has the right to speak regarding any claims about their property. The room buzzed with whispers. Karen gripped the edge of the table. Fine. You have 2 minutes. I walked to the front and connected my laptop to the projector. My name is Johnson, I began, and I'm here to discuss how this HOA fraudulently claimed 2,100 acres of my family's farmland while my mother was dying of cancer. The room went completely silent. That's a ridiculous accusation, Karen snapped. Your mother signed over the property rights voluntarily. Did she? I clicked to the first document. A signature page, dated July 17. This supposed land transfer has my mother's signature dated July 17 last year. I clicked to the next slide, showing hospital records. That same day, she was in the hospital having emergency surgery. Physically impossible for her to sign anything. Gasps filled the room. One board member, a gray-haired man named Tom, leaned forward with a frown. Is this accurate? Karen's face flushed red. This is just a misunderstanding about dates. It's not just one date, I continued, showing more documents. Here are 5 different agreements supposedly signed by my mother, each one dated when hospital records show she was either in surgery, heavily medicated, or unconscious. Mrs. Olson stood up from her seat. I've known the Johnson family for 50 years, she said. Their farm was here long before any of your fancy houses. That land rightfully belongs to them. Karen banged her gavel. Order. This is getting out of hand. Sarah stepped forward. The Johnson family has filed official complaints with the county regarding fraudulent real estate practices and elder abuse. A criminal investigation is pending. Board members exchanged worried glances. Tom turned to Karen. You assured us this property acquisition was completely legitimate. It was, Karen insisted, her voice getting higher. We've invested hundreds of thousands in planning and permits. We can't stop now. I clicked to my final slide. A technical diagram of the county power grid. There's another problem, I said. As regional grid supervisor for Northeast Power Authority, I've reviewed your development plans. I pulled out my employee ID and placed it on the table. The proposed construction would dangerously overload Substation 12, creating significant fire hazards. Karen's husband, Doug, jumped to his feet. You can't use your position to block this project. That's a conflict of interest. Actually, I replied calmly, it's my legal obligation to reject unsafe infrastructure plans. I zoomed in on the diagram. Your luxury homes would require triple the power capacity currently available. The necessary upgrades would take at least 18 months and cost millions, which neither the power company nor the county has budgeted for. The room erupted in chaos. Homeowners shouted questions while board members huddled together, whispering urgently. This is outrageous. Karen screamed over the noise. You can't do this. I just did. Tom raised his hand for quiet. I move that we pause all Harvest Estates activities until these serious allegations are resolved. I second that motion, said another board member. Karen looked like she might explode. You don't understand what's at stake here. We've made commitments to developers. As the board voted overwhelmingly to pause the project, I noticed Doug Thompson slip out his phone, glaring at me the entire time. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The victory feeling lasted until I got home. As I pulled into the driveway, my headlights swept across the front yard. My breath caught in my throat. Huge red letters had been spray-painted across my barn. This isn't over. My stomach twisted. I parked and slowly approached the house, noticing my front door standing slightly open. Inside, papers were scattered everywhere. Mom's journals. Family photos. Farm records. All dumped onto the floor. But on the kitchen table lay a single piece of paper with a typed message.
Everyone has secrets. Even your mother. Even you.
My hand shook as I picked up the phone and called Sheriff Miller. The war for my mother's land had just gotten much more personal. I woke up shivering in total darkness. Flipping the light switch, nothing.
Strange.
Only my house had no power, while Meadowbrook's fancy streetlights glowed brightly outside my window.
This wasn't an accident.
My phone lit up with worried messages from old family friends.
Emergency HOA meeting happened last night. Karen told everyone you're stealing electricity. They're coming for your land today. Be careful.
Heart pounding, I grabbed Mom's old flashlight and checked the circuit breaker.
Everything looked normal. Which meant someone had cut my connection from outside. I tried calling the power company. No answer. A voice made me jump. Going somewhere important? I turned. Karen stood at my fence line with Doug Wilson and two men in suits I didn't recognize. My fists clenched. What did you do to my power?
I demanded, marching toward them.
Karen put on a loud, theatrical voice as if performing for an audience.
We've discovered illegal connections from our development to your property, she announced.
The power company is investigating.
That's ridiculous.
This farm has had legal power for 70 years. Karen smiled coldly. Not according to the emergency inspection we requested. I noticed people filming from their cars.
A local news van had parked down the road. They'd planned this whole show. I took a deep breath, keeping my voice steady.
Get off my property. Doug unrolled a large map with new boundary lines that cut right through my house.
Actually, he said, according to our latest survey.
I drove to work, hoping to fix the power issue myself. But when I reached my office,
the door was locked. My boss, Richard, stood in the hallway, looking uncomfortable.
I'm sorry, he said, handing me an envelope. You're on administrative leave. I froze. What? Pending an investigation into misuse of authority. What investigation? Richard sighed.
There have been allegations that you've been manipulating power access to force the HOA to back down on legitimate land claims.
My stomach dropped. Jack Thompson. Karen's husband.
Richard looked even more uncomfortable.
He brought the complaint to the board yesterday. Wait, Jack Thompson is on our board? Richard nodded. Vice chairman. For 3 years now.
I sat in my truck, hands shaking with anger. They'd planned this perfectly.
Cut my power. Damaged my reputation. Removed my ability to fight back through my job. My phone rang. An unfamiliar number. I answered. Is this the Johnson farm? A gruff voice asked. Yes. Who's calling? Dave Miller with Channel 8 News.
We received an anonymous tip about illegal utility connections at your property.
Care to comment? Before I could answer, heavy engines roared in the distance. Through my rearview mirror, I watched 3 bulldozers with the Harvest Estates logo rumbling down my driveway,
followed by trucks carrying armed security guards.
I raced home, skidding to a stop in front of the bulldozers. Sheriff Adams pulled up moments later. You can't let them do this, I shouted. He handed me a document. An emergency court order. Judge Phillips signed it an hour ago. I blinked.
Judge Phillips.
Karen's uncle.
My hands are tied until your hearing next month, the sheriff said quietly.
But between us? Something stinks about all this. I watched helplessly as the security guards set up a perimeter. And the bulldozers began clearing my western field. News cameras captured everything from the road.
That evening, I retreated to Mom's old storm cellar, the one place where I could think without being watched. I felt beaten as I stared at her rows of preserves and emergency supplies.
What would you do, Mom? I whispered. My fingers traced the rough wooden shelves she'd built decades ago. Behind a loose board, I noticed something metallic. Curious, I pulled harder. A hidden compartment. Inside, a rusted metal box. I had never seen it before. With shaking hands, I opened it. Inside lay yellowed papers. Original land grants. Surveys from the 1800s. Photographs of my grandfather with county officials.
But one document made my heart race. The original power grid agreements from 1952.
When my grandfather had granted easements for the first rural electrification project.
I scanned the faded text with Mom's flashlight, hands trembling.
Then I found it.
A clause. Circled in faded red ink. In perpetuity, the Johnson family retains override authority for any utility modifications affecting their granted easements. Beneath these papers lay a leather-bound journal.
Mom's handwriting. Detailed accounts of HOA harassment. Copies of threatening letters. And recordings of conversations stored on tiny flash drives. On the final page, Mom had written, "Always have a backup plan.
And remember who actually owns the power lines that run through our land."
A loud crash overhead made me jump.
Through the cellar's tiny window, I saw security guards searching my house.
Throwing furniture. Breaking windows.
I clutched the documents to my chest, suddenly understanding.
Mom's final gift to me.
The HOA thought they had all the power. But they had no idea what I held in my hands.
For the first time in weeks, I smiled. County courthouse, emergency hearing.
3 large news vans crowded the courthouse parking lot.
Neighbors. Farmers. HOA members. Curious onlookers.
Karen brushed past me, hissing in my ear.
"You won't win this." My hands shook slightly. Not from fear. I hadn't slept in 2 days.
Judge Reynolds, a stern woman with silver hair, called the hearing to order.
"Mrs.
Thompson," she began, "your HOA claims rightful ownership of disputed farmland based on annexation papers signed 5 years ago. Mr. Johnson, you claim fraud and illegal seizure."
"Let's begin."
Karen's lawyer strode forward confidently. "Your Honor, the Meadowbrook Association legally incorporated this abandoned farmland through proper channels."
I gritted my teeth. Abandoned? Mom never left that farm. Not until they took her to the hospital. Judge Reynolds examined the forged signatures. "These appear to be in order." "Mr. Johnson, your response?" Sarah Winters stepped up.
"Your Honor, before addressing land ownership, we must resolve a more urgent matter." She turned toward the packed courtroom. "Mr. Johnson has discovered critical documents that change everything about this case."
I walked forward, heart pounding. Holding up the rusted metal box. These original power grid easements from 1952 contain a unique clause. I pointed.
"In perpetuity, the Johnson family retains override authority over all utility modifications on this land."
Gasps. Karen's face turned ashen. Judge Reynolds studied the documents. "These appear authentic." I locked eyes with Karen. "Your entire development relies on power lines you don't control."
The courtroom erupted into whispers.
Karen's lawyer stood frozen.
The Northeast Power Authority attorney, an older man with gray hair, leaned forward, eyes widening. "This means," Sarah continued, "regardless of who owns the surface land, the Johnson family maintains legal control over all power infrastructure crossing the original 2,100 acres, including the lines that service the entire Meadowbrook development."
The murmurs grew louder. Karen's hands gripped the table.
Judge Reynolds tapped her gavel.
"Order." The power company attorney stood.
"Your Honor, our legal team reviewed these documents overnight."
He cleared his throat. "They are genuine and legally binding." He turned toward me. "We are withdrawing all actions against Mr. Johnson and reinstating him immediately with full back pay."
Karen jumped to her feet.
"This is absurd. Those papers are ancient. We have modern development plans approved by the county. Sarah didn't flinch.
And those modern development plans, she countered, require utility approval. She turned to the judge. Which, according to this document, requires my client's consent. Judge Reynolds sat back, pressing her lips together. Mrs. Thompson, she said, control yourself.
Karen shook her head violently. No. No, this isn't over. Sarah wasn't finished. Your Honor, we have more evidence to present. She held up Mom's journal.
During Mrs. Johnson's cancer treatments, the HOA systematically harassed her and falsified documents.
She placed the forged HOA annexation papers side by side with Mom's medical records. The dates match perfectly, she said.
Judge Reynolds studied the pages. Karen's lawyer opened his mouth, but Sarah raised a hand.
There's more. She pulled out a USB drive. We have recordings. She clicked play.
Karen's voice filled the courtroom.
She'll be dead soon anyway. Just backdate the papers. We'll deal with whatever kid inherits later. Gasps.
Karen's face drained of color. That's edited, she sputtered.
Sarah's voice remained calm. We've had these recordings authenticated by 2 independent experts. The judge's expression darkened.
Based on this evidence, she said, I'm issuing an immediate freeze on all development activities pending criminal investigation. She turned to the sheriff.
Secure the Johnson property immediately. 3 hours later, I walked out of the courthouse. Bright sunshine. News reporters swarmed me. How does it feel to take on a powerful HOA and win? Will you press criminal charges against Karen Thompson? Do you plan to restore power to Meadowbrook?
I raised my hands for quiet.
My family has farmed this land for generations, I said. We've always been good neighbors. I never wanted this fight, I just wanted what rightfully belongs to my family. Camera flashes. Karen was escorted into a police car. For a moment, our eyes met.
Then she looked away. That evening, I sat on Mom's porch steps.
Sheriff Adams supervised the removal of construction equipment from my fields. My phone hadn't stopped ringing. Neighbors. Friends. Even Jack Thompson, Karen's husband, offering a private settlement. Sarah pulled up with takeout food.
The district attorney wants to meet tomorrow about criminal charges, she said, handing me a sandwich.
And Northeast Power's CEO called personally. They want to apologize. I chewed thoughtfully. What happens to the Meadowbrook residents? I asked. Legally, nothing changes with their homes, Sarah said.
But the HOA will likely be dissolved once the fraud investigation concludes.
6 weeks later. My restored farmhouse hummed with activity.
Northeast Power crews installed new lines under my supervision.
As regional manager. With a promotion and substantial raise. The doorbell rang. Doug Wilson stood awkwardly on my porch with several former HOA members. We wanted to apologize, he said quietly. Karen and Jack convinced us you were blocking community improvements. We never knew about the fraud. I studied their faces. Come in, I said. We should talk.
Around my kitchen table, neighbors who had once been enemies shared coffee and honest conversation.
Most had been misled by Karen's promises of higher property values and exclusive amenities.
What happens to our neighborhood now? Asked Elaine Foster, an elderly woman who had lived there since before the HOA formed.
I leaned forward. That's up to you, I said. But I have some ideas. 2 months later.
As autumn painted the cornfields gold, neighbors from both the farm community and former Meadowbrook gathered in my renovated barn.
Children played on hay bales. Adults discussed the newly formed Pine Grove Valley Community Association. A democratic organization. Replacing the disbanded HOA. Sarah joined me by the window.
Watching as former enemies became neighbors.
Your mother would be proud, she said softly. Outside, Workers removed the last harvest estate sign from my property.
In its place, they hung a simple wooden plaque.
Johnson Family Farm, EST 1897. I exhaled. You know what I learned from all this?
I asked Sarah, watching fireflies appear over the fields.
She raised an eyebrow. Real power isn't about control, I said. It's not about money. Or fancy houses. It's about standing up for what's right. Even when you're standing alone. Dusk settled over 2,100 acres of farmland. Now legally protected by new conservation easements.
And I knew without a doubt.
Mom's legacy was safe. For generations to come. And a reminder that sometimes, against all odds, justice finds a way. The end.